Hey class, in this video we're going to be covering nested loops. We're going to learn how to create a nested loop to create a pattern that has both columns and rows. And in the next video we'll talk about how to make different variations on that pattern. So let's get started. I'm going to open up GitHub, desktop, switch to MMP 210 and click show in Finder. And so last time we had pattern version 1, pattern version 2. So let's make a new project for pattern version 3. So I'm going to duplicate pattern version 2 and make that pattern version 3. And I'm just going to delete the thumbnail, and I can go ahead and delete sketch.js as well because I'll be starting from scratch. So I'll just have the index template, the P5 library, and the style.css. So then I'm going to take the MMP 210 folder and open it in Sublime. And I'll open up pattern version 3, and let's change the title for this one. Let's call this nested loop. We'll call this nested loop. And I think that's everything that we need to change. So now we're just going to create our sketch file. So I'm going to do Command N, save as sketch.js. And I'll start with a comment. So this is our nested loop. And this is just kind of an example to get us prepared for the second video of this week, where we will talk about creating a pattern using a nested loop. So we're just going to review our basic loop, and then we're going to add a little bit more. So let's start with our function setup. I can actually make this page a bit bigger. Say create canvas, do our normal 640 by 360, and then let's do function draw. And let's create our for loop. We learned for loops last week, so we'll just review. And so for this for loop, I want to draw circles going across the screen to start what could be a pattern. So I'm going to start with for let x equal 0. So I'll start on the left side of the screen. X is less than width. So I'll keep going over to the right side of the screen. And then x plus equals. This value will be the interval between each one of our columns in our loop. So let's start with 100. And then I'm just going to draw an ellipse. I'm going to use the x value here. So I'll put x for x. And then I'm going to give them all the same y value. So I'll do 180, so it's in the middle. And I'll make them all the same size. So I'll do 50 for the size. So this is our basic loop. Let's review what this is going to do. So if we have our canvas, remember that x is 0 here, and it's 640 over here. We start with let x equal 0. That's our initial condition. And we draw an ellipse. So when x is 0, we're going to draw an ellipse at 0x, 180y, which is somewhere right here, and the size is going to be 50 pixels. So that's the first ellipse that we're going to draw. Then we're going to check, is x less than width? 0 is less than width, right? 0 is less than 640. So that's true. So then we'll increment x. So now x will be 100. So we'll move over to 100. We'll draw another ellipse at 100x and 180y. And so that's the second time through the loop. So then we'll check again. X is now 100. 100 is less than 640, or x is less than width. That's still true. So we'll jump up to 200. Okay, and we'll draw another ellipse here. And we'll check again. Is 200 less than 640? Is x less than width? Yes, it is. So we'll do x plus 100 again. So we'll jump up to 300 on x, and we'll draw another circle. We'll check again. I'm going to go over here since we're running out of space. So 300 is less than 640. That's true again. So we'll x plus equals 100 again. So we'll be at 400. Draw another ellipse. I'm running out of space on the canvas, so I'll make the next couple a little bit smaller. So now we're at 400. 400 is still less than 640. And so we're going to x plus plus again. So that brings us to 500. draw another ellipse. We're going to check, is 500 less than 640? Yes, it is. Okay, so we're going to jump up again. Now we're going to be x plus equals 100. We'll be at 600, somewhere around here, kind of running out of space. So 600 is still less than 640. So we're going to go one more time to 700, but then 700 is not less than 640. Okay, so that's when our loop stops. So when this condition is false, our loop is going to be over. So let's check that in the browser. So I'm going to go to Tools, Start Sublime Server, open up a new window, go to localhost 8080, and I have to type in pattern version 3 here so we can see each one of our circles. So let's add a background here. And so we can see each one of our circles going across. So we can see that that was true. We can also take a look at what x is. So we can say text of x at x, and let's maybe move it down to 200. I'll move it down a little bit further to 300. So we can see x starts at 0, then x plus equals 100 gets us to here, and then we keep going across our page. So we have a bit more space, so maybe we can make this smaller. We can make it like 50, so we can kind of fit everything in here. So we are missing a little bit at the edge, so I might just change this to be 600, and maybe I'll do a different dimension, so 600 by 400. And then this last bit right here, since we're going by 50s, that's actually going to be exactly width. So if we want to grab that, we can do less than or equal to width. So if we hit right on that line, we can always change this to be less than or equal to width to get the ellipse on that last line. So that's our basic loop. And we can see that we've made a pattern, okay, that goes across the page. So what if we want to make a pattern that not only has columns, right, which are, you know, divisions horizontally across the page, but what if we also want some rows? So we can do the same thing on the y-axis. Let's try that real quick to make rows. So I'm just going to comment this out for a moment. So if we do the exact same thing on the y-axis, we'll make rows. So if we say for let y equals 0, y is less than or equal to height, y plus equals 50, and draw an ellipse, now we're going to say 300 for x and y for the y value and 50 for the size. Now we have ellipses going from the top, 0y, to the bottom, height, which is also 400. And so now we have rows. So it's basically the same thing, we're just going in a different direction. And we're using the variable y because we use y to describe the vertical axis. So now how can I combine these? So this is where we're going to use a nested loop. And this is a very tricky concept, but hopefully you'll see how it works. Essentially what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put one of these loops inside of one of these loops. And so now I'm going to remove this for a moment. Let's actually change this since we changed y. Okay, so we have two separate loops. One is going across the x-axis. One's going across down the y-axis. And so how can we put these together to get a full sort of grid of columns and rows? So basically what we're going to do is we're simply going to put this for loop inside of this for loop. And so what will happen, it's a bit tricky. It adds a bit of complexity. But basically what will happen, so let's put in the code first and then we'll draw it. So I'm just going to delete this. I'm going to copy my y loop and put it in here. And then I'm going to delete the ellipse for a second. So let's just think about what this is going to do. So let's draw our canvas. Use a rectangle tool this time so it's a little more even. And so we have 0, 0 here. We have the x-axis going this way. We have the y-axis going down. So we're going to start with x equals 0. Okay, so that's on the left. And y equals 0. Okay, so inside of our first for loop, x is 0 and y is 0. So we're going to draw an ellipse right here at 0, 0. Now we're going to do our y. So is 0 less than height? Yes. So we add 50. So we're going to go down 50, then check again. So now 50 is less than height. Yep. So let's go down to 100. Okay, 100 is less than height. Yes. Let's keep going. Okay, 150 is less than height. Yes, we're going to go again. Okay, and we keep going down the y-axis until we reach the end. At that point, we're going to leave this for loop. Okay, we're going to leave this for loop and we're going to go back to this for loop, at which point we do x plus equals 50. So now x plus equals 50. Okay, so 50 over here. And now we do this for loop from scratch. So remember, the code inside of the for loop runs from scratch at each time we go through the for loop. So we do the whole y for loop completely over again. So now y is equal to 0, so we draw one here. Then y plus 50, we go down. Y plus 50, we go down. Y plus 50, we go down. Y plus 50, we keep going until we get to the end. And then once we hit false, y is no longer less than height. Then we go back. Okay, so now x is 50. So we plus equals 50. X is now 100. 100 is still less than width. So we go over to 100. And we draw a new circle at 0. So we start from 0, y equals 0 again. And so we repeat this pattern going down, 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 and then going across. Going down, 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 down on y, going across. And we do that until x is no longer less than width, which is going to be somewhere over here. So it's a bit complicated because we're running one line of code a whole bunch of times, but you can see if I draw an ellipse, I use x for x, y for y, and let's do 50 for the size. Now I have a nice grid. So that's basically our nested loop. So let's take a look at some of these, how this works a little bit. So if we move x over, we start x at 0 because our canvas starts at 0, but we can move it over. If we move it over, the whole grid moves over. If we move it back, it doesn't really matter, but we can't see it because we can't see it. But if I move it back a little, now we can see that my circles actually start, over here since the circles draw from the middle. So if we leave x at 0, you can see the circle at the top on this side are drawing half. If we change to x equals 25, which is half the circle, we move over a bit. Okay, x is less than or equal to width. We can also change this. If I make something smaller, like 100, we're not going to go as far. So our grid is going to be horizontally smaller. So we're using width here because our canvas, that gives us the whole width of the canvas. But we don't necessarily need to do that. Finally, the increment value determines how far apart our rows and columns are. So this is the difference in 50 pixels. So if we change that value, if we make it 100, then the columns are going to be farther apart. Okay, so the x is the columns, the y is the rows. So same thing for our y loop. If we start y as something larger, we'll start farther down the canvas. If we start it at 25, then we'll start with the top of the circle. If we change the height to something smaller, we'll have fewer rows. And if we change the increment, we'll have more space in between the rows. We can also make it smaller. We can overlap the rows if we want, but usually if we're creating a grid design, we want everything to fit in that space. One thing that can be useful here is using like a width and height variable. Okay, so we might say like let w equal 50 and let height equal, we could also do 50. So then we can use width here and height here. We can use width and height for the ellipse as well. Okay, so if we change one of them, change the width to 100, then everything changes with the grid. So if we use the same width for the increment, as well as the width of the ellipse, and the same height for the rows increment here and the height for the ellipse, then everything will adjust to match. So if I make the height much larger, everything adjusts. So that makes it easier to create patterns because we can use these values to determine where to start and end our pattern. So I can also use width over 2 for X if I want the pattern to fit inside the canvas, and height over 2 for Y. Okay, so now I have a slightly different pattern. I can actually set height to width if I prefer to keep everything even. Okay, or width over 2 if I want to do something specific. So there's a lot of different ways that I can adjust this pattern to fit the design that I want. However, this is just using ellipse. If we put a different shape in here, so let's put in a rectangle. So we'll do rectangle at X, Y, width and height. Now, because the rectangle draws from the top left, everything is kind of moved over a bit. So we still get our same grid going this way and this way, but because we're starting at width over 2, height over 2, we might want to change those now to 0 and 0 to match the grid to the canvas. So it kind of depends on what shapes you're using. Obviously, you can also change the rect mode to be center to fix that issue if you want. Just kind of depends on what your approach is to your design. So let's go back to the ellipses. We can also, let's visualize this a bit. So I'm gonna make our grid a bit smaller. And let's draw some text so we can see the X and Y values. So I'm gonna draw a text of the X, and actually let's give it a little label. So I'll say X plus X, and then I'll put that at X and Y. And then I'll do text of Y plus Y. And I'll put this one at X plus 20 and Y. So it'll be moved over a little bit. Actually, let's move it down a little bit. So let's say X and Y plus 20. So now we can see the X and Y value of each one of our ellipses. So we can see, so let's move these over real quick so we can see this. So now we see all of our ellipses, and let's take a look. So here we have 50-50. Okay, then we increase to 50-150, 50-250, 50-350. So all the X's in the first column are the same, and the Y's increase. Then if we look across a row, the Y's stay the same, 50, 50, 50, 50, 50, 50, and the X's increase by 100 each time. So we can see the math bears out if we look at it, but we don't really need to look at it. If we learn how the nested for loop works, we can create a grid without thinking a lot about what's happening. In the next video, we'll go over generating some new patterns. If you want to kind of practice to get started with that, I recommend using these values and trying to add stuff into your design. So like if we wanted to add some other stuff going on, we could draw like a rectangle at X, Y, and maybe width over 2, height over 2. So we have a smaller rectangle. Maybe make it even smaller. So let's just do like 10 by 10. And maybe we can move it around. So we could say like X plus 10 to move it over. We could say Y minus 10 to move it over. Okay, maybe we could add another rectangle and do X going the other way. Okay, so now we kind of have these like little weird glasses. Maybe I can move one of the X's farther over. Okay, so we can start to create a pattern within. Now we're kind of designing like our own little shape or our own little drawing inside each one of these sort of shells. So play around with that, see if you can add some more shapes and add to the design here. So I'm gonna say add more shapes to create the design. You can also play with different colors and create a repeating pattern. In the next video, we'll introduce randomness to create generative patterns. And so we'll go over how that changes what's happening in our sketch. So that's it for this video. I'm not gonna make a link for this one because basically just explaining how the nested loop works. So I'll make a link for the generative pattern in the next video. So I'm just gonna go to GitHub and just say adds pattern version 3 nested